Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our discussion of money magnetism. There's some really wonderfully important ideas in this book, in the end part of the book. So I hope you will continue to enjoy it as I have. Let's now start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Guru Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. We are your children, wandering about in this world looking for our happiness. Make your presence known in such a way that we see you behind every thought and action and feel your presence in every activity. Show us the way to live our lives in true devotion, true surrender, and deep, long-lasting, unselfish service to your cause of self-realization for all and to your loving presence in everyone. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, this book actually has a last part, which is called The Method, which is, I think, where we'll go tomorrow. But today, Swami just talks about why the material and the spiritual world, why it does not serve us to think of the material and the spiritual world as separate. We have to understand this is actually a fundamental teaching of Master of Paramahansa Yogananda for this time and place. I often reference the yugas, the rising and falling ages of expanding and contracting consciousness on this planet. And I reference them often not because it's sort of an esoteric bit of information that I can throw in, whenever I feel to. I do it because it has a fundamental relevance to everything that Master taught. Master was commissioned by Babaji and Jesus. And what exactly that means, especially when you put into the context that at the end of his life, Swami asserted that he thought Master had been Jesus in a previous life. But what's happening is this very long cycle of leadership on a level that most people don't even know is there, but is in fact the most powerful thing happening on the planet. When Swamiji reflected about how many incarnations Master himself revealed, previous incarnations, not only for himself, but for about others of our previous lifetimes of others of this line of masters, he raised the very interesting question that perhaps this group of gurus has had a special responsibility for the development of planet Earth for a very long time. Swami had no way of declaring that that was the truth, but the reappearance, the constant reappearance as avatars over the course of many yuga cycles, you just sort of wonder on a certain level what's really going on here. And one of the things you see that's happening, one of the distinguishing characteristics between Kali Yuga, which is the age of matter, which is the lowest age, and Dwapara Yuga, which is the age of energy, which is what we're moving into at this time, is this separation between different aspects of life. When you deal with things that are on the material plane, they're physical. This is a physical book. My physical body is separate than the physical book, separate than the chair I'm sitting on. We have this sense that everything is different from everything else. Once we start moving into the age of energy, we're not yet at the point where we can automatically perceive it as a civilization. But we now have the scientific compelling evidence, and we also have the inner understanding that far from everything being unrelated, this reality that all of matter is just a vibration of energy just changes our idea of separateness. And the way the masters explain it is in a dark age, in a heavy materialistic age, which is what Kali Yuga is. Now, I always have to say, this is a planetary drama that defines civilization as a whole. The individual soul lives completely outside the planetary drama. It may incarnate and participate in it, but the individual soul consciousness is never limited. Jesus was a full avatar, and he came in the depths of Kali Yuga. He was just a fully awakened, liberated being who came to help the planet Earth during that age. But during the age of Kali, matter and spirit just appear to be different. People go out and live in the desert, in isolation. Monasteries flourish. Monasteries are isolated and sequestered, cloistered, because you just can't live in the world and be spiritual because the forces are too dense. I mean, as a civilization, not as individuals, but as a civilization. But when we start moving into Dwapara, all the boundaries begin to dissolve. And if you look at the way the world is developing and the tremendous conflicts that are happening in the world today are all because we are shifting from Kali Yuga consciousness, in which all the forms were clear cut and everybody stayed in their box. And now we're in an age where the forms are absolutely disintegrating and nobody stays in their box and nothing stays in its box. In the United States at this time, the country of the United States is becoming multicultural, multiracial. The color of the people in this country is becoming all mixed up. I myself live in Silicon Valley, which of course is really in the vanguard of this sort of thing. There is no dominant culture in Silicon Valley. It's very interesting. 1/3 Spanish as the first language from all the Spanish-speaking parts of the world. 1/3 Asian, which goes from India to Japan to Samoan Islanders, whatever people would call. I'm not sure if the Islanders are considered Asian. That wouldn't be true, but they're darker skinned. Sometimes the Asians are darker skinned, not always, but sometimes. But the Asians, quote, look different than the European white. I don't know if any of these words are the right words anymore, but that's what I mean. 1/3 Asian, however you call that, and 1/3 everybody else, which would mean, that means the Jews, that means everybody who's an immigrant from some other part of the world that isn't Asia and that isn't Spanish speaking. And the number of cross-cultural families that you see is just everywhere. Just when you just walk around in public, you hear so many languages. It's just the little street that I live on. It's a United Nations. And it's not even unusual. This is just sort of the way it is. This is very, very disturbing to Kali Yuga mindset, where there's white privilege, there's white supremacy, there's the European obligation to impose its civilization on dark-skinned peoples in other parts of the world, the white man's burden, that was the phrase I was trying to remember. Just all of these things that for many of us were never true and now become ludicrous. But the Kali Yuga mindset is desperately trying to protect the rigidity of forms. And it's having a really, really hard time, not really because of politics, but because of consciousness. Because the consciousness of planet Earth is shifting, and it's shifting into Dwapara Yuga, and all those energy forms are just breaking apart. And so those who need them are frantically fighting to keep them. And those of us who think it's long overdue to dissolve them are rejoicing as we literally become a global village. It's just the way it is. And all the technology that has made that possible which you go back to Steve Jobs being so highly influenced by Paramahansa Yogananda, and Yogananda being a dark-skinned Asian coming over into America to break apart these things. Now, I'm talking about cultural and racial and those kinds of rigidities, but the other rigidity, deeply inherited from Kali Yuga, is that worldliness and spiritualness are complete opposites. And poverty means spirituality, money means worldliness. I shared way at the beginning of this whole series that at a certain point in my life at Ananda, when it was necessary for me to earn money and to build a small house, and a nice house, not just a rustic cabin, but a nice house, I felt my spiritual life was profoundly threatened by the idea that I might not be observably poverty-stricken. If I looked at all like I had integrated myself into worldly life, I was afraid that I wouldn't be considered spiritual anymore by myself or by God. Now, Swami always contradicted that, but it took me a while to catch up to it. So one of the reasons Swami wrote this book, Money Magnetism, and the reason he wrote the much bigger course, Material Success Through Yogic Principles, is that Kali Yuga is over. And money is energy, and our ability to work with money is our ability to work with energy. And it's also time for East and West to come together. There is a tradition that is perhaps true. It was based on a vision that a Catholic Pope had. And he said that he saw that the West, and this was as Kali Yuga was descending, he saw that the West was going to specialize in material efficiency, and the East, primarily India, was going to specialize in spiritual understanding. And so the West became increasingly materialistic, especially America. India became greatly impoverished, but nonetheless kept the tradition alive. And now, Master said, it's time. Those two forces don't have to be kept apart anymore. In Kali Yuga, the capacity of man's mind, this is how it's described, could not hold both realities. Either had to concentrate on spiritual or concentrate on material, and couldn't see how they were integrated. But now consciousness is rising, culture is changing, civilization is changing, and one of the things that's happening, and this is lamentable from a certain point of view, meaning if you're attached to this form, it's lamentable. But the monasteries are dying. These monastic orders that have lasted for centuries, women and men, where I've read about it, especially in the Catholic convents. There's a whole lifestyle that's all based on a continuous inflow of young novitiates. And they take care of the older ones, and they do the work, and then the old ones, mentor the young ones. But the vocations are just drying up. The vocations in the priesthood, the vocations in the convents are just drying up. Huge convents have just a handful of people all over the world. But it's not because people are feeling less spiritual. It's that they feel that the way to express their spirituality is to be engaged with the world. And so it's not that they don't want to worship God or give their lives to God. It's how they understand that is different. And so this is where understanding money from the spiritual perspective is really what we're trying to do. And the conclusion of this part of the book of Swamiji, well, he talks about his own life. He became a monk when he was 22 years old. He lived on a very small allowance from that point until he was 36, when he was suddenly expelled from the monastery. And then he had to decide what he was going to do with the rest of his life. But he'd given his life to God. He'd given his life to serving the Guru. And one of the things that Master really had wanted to have happen was the founding of small spiritual communities in which people could dedicate their lives to God, even if they didn't want to become traditionally monks or nuns. It was for couples. It was for raising families. It was a Dwapara Yuga lifestyle where we'll have home, job, and church in one place, as Master put it, and we'll discover that life itself is a spiritual event. It's not like if I want to be spiritual, I have to leave everything behind and go off and live in this very extreme way. I can live in a more or less recognizable, what you might call traditional, normal way, and still be utterly devoted to God. And so the founding of the Ananda communities was to make a living example of how this could actually be done. When Swami dedicated this community in Palo Alto, he dedicated it in 1989. And he spoke of how Babaji is very pleased with this community. He says, if we can show in the midst of Silicon Valley, one of the most progressive, most expansive, most creative, most Dwapara Yuga areas of the world, and also deeply materialistic and money-oriented, that one can still live for God in this environment. He said it'll prove that it can be done anywhere by anyone. So, but once you start operating in the world and trying to accomplish something in the world, you always run up against money. So when Swamiji, at the age of 36, began to try to reassemble what his life was going to be about, he gradually felt drawn that the aspect of Master's work that no one else was taking care of, that he felt inspired to do. In fact, he had already thought of the importance of small intentional communities when he was 15 years old, which was 7 years before he met Master. And so he was delighted to discover that the same idea that had come to him when he was a teenager was a cherished principle of Master's. But if you're going to start a community, well, you need money. It's as simple as that. Swami's, one of Master's statements is, every good, noble, or philanthropic work, sooner or later, comes down to a matter of money. Because it's just, this is the way the world works. And we can lament it. We can try to create systems in which money is not so important. But one way or another, energy has to be generated. And then that energy converted into whatever form it is you're trying to magnetize. Now, if you say it just like that, it's quite self-evidently, it's a spiritual practice. Energy has to be generated. That energy has to be focused. That focused energy has to then manifest with intelligence and creativity and attunement to a higher reality. So Swami feels drawn to start a community. He begins to look for land. He needs buildings, and he needs money. So Swami himself remarks he grew up in a business environment. His father was a high executive in, it was called Standard Oil then, but it became Esso later on. His father was an oil geologist. Swami, when his family came back to America when he was 13, they moved into Scarsdale, New York. When his parents moved to the West Coast, they moved to Atherton. Both of these are very affluent communities. And Swamiji moved in a circle of people who were, they weren't the 1% of wealth, but they were affluent and successful in the world, and that was a high value to them. To Swamiji, it meant nothing at all. In fact, as he describes himself as a teenager and is in college, he scorned people who were studying business. It just seemed to him like a pursuit beneath contempt. You know, he was an artist and a philosopher, and all of those were his realities. But then when he found himself needing to make this community, all of a sudden, for the first time in his life, literally, he had to, his problem was money. Now, he had another aspect to this, which is very interesting, which is because his life was given entirely to Master, even though he needed money, he refused to do anything except continue to serve Master. He could not give his energy to any cause except his Guru's cause. So he brought the two forces together. He wrote books, he gave classes, he eventually wrote music, he gave concerts. Everything he did to earn the money to build Ananda was central to what Ananda was also about. So he remained absolutely consistent in what he was doing. But he became absolutely so pressured financially that, as he describes it in the book, he had to work on a level with an energy that, even though he'd always been high energy, it was way beyond anything he'd done before. For a long time, he lived with his parents. Then he moved into an apartment in San Francisco. And he drove hundreds of miles every week from one end of the Bay Area to another, giving classes in a different city every night. And then once the Ananda property was purchased up in Nevada City, after his last class on Thursday or Friday, he would drive up to Nevada City, to the fledgling community. Then he would give Saturday and Sunday programs there. Then he would drive back and start the whole cycle over, and generated tens and tens of thousands of dollars, and met unscrupulous business people who tried to cheat him out of what he had done. He met incompetent people who made promises that they didn't keep. He met antagonistic people who did their best to dismantle what he was creating. In other words, there you are. There's life, isn't it? Once you move out of the ashram, and even in the ashram, sometimes you find those things. But once you move out into the ashram and just move among the marketplaces of the world, then all of a sudden, tremendous obstacles are also met. Now, Swamiji did all this willingly. He did not do it as a martyr. He did not complain. He did not feel that, God was treating him unfairly. But it was a tremendous challenge. And he grew weary of having to always think in terms of money. But he accepted the challenge without reservation, embraced it wholeheartedly, gave himself to it completely, and of course succeeded magnificently in it. But he said when the most intense effort crested, and he was at least established enough. Here's property that's paid off. People have begun to come. The community is beginning to have it. And he was able to pull back even just a little. He realized that what he had defined at the time as a tremendous materialistic effort, all the benefit he felt was spiritual. Yes, he also had this material thing to show, but he said, in facing the challenge of having to earn money, which is a challenge he would rather never have had to face, he thought, he said, all of his gain was spiritual. He gained willpower, he gained in commitment, and he also said very powerfully, he gained in faith. And that faith was twofold. The faith was in himself, that it doesn't matter what the challenge is. I can harness my willpower, focus my will, and simply go through it. Now, we think sometimes when we come into life that the egoic idea of good is ease and pleasure. The soul's idea of good is challenge and growth. And it's the conflict between these two realities, excuse me, that actually sort of chews us up in the middle. And because Swami had to accept something so uncongenial to him, but just simply did it, it erased to a large extent that thought in his mind of what? Of Kali Yuga versus Dwapara. Everything is just energy. Everything is just an opportunity. And especially when the effort we are making is for a divine purpose. Swami has in this book this wonderful quote from Master, making money honestly and industriously to serve God's work, and that's the important key, to serve God's work is the next greatest art to the art of realizing God. Why would that be true? And that would be true because money is it's a teacher. And the ability to make money is a teaching. honestly and industriously to serve God's work. I'm going to reference now what I was talking about for a couple of days, which was tithing. I mean, this is another reason why tithing is so important. You may have a situation where your life demands that you are not able to devote yourself entirely to God's work, as Swami was. He became a monk at a young age and lived as a renunciate his entire life. Even though he was married for a time, he never embraced any reality except entirely the spiritual. And as I said, he never gave his energy to anything except the spiritual. But many people have other karmas that also have to be acted out. But if your job is not in itself explicitly serving the divine, if you know that a percentage of everything you earn is going to go to serve God's work, then you bring yourself closer into this next greatest art, which is earning money honestly and industriously to serve God's work. If you know that $1 of every $100 you earn, one dime of every dollar that you earn is going to serve God's work, it's an incentive, and it's a very uplifting incentive, and that you know that your efforts specifically will help many people spiritually and are a way of serving God. Now, Swami goes on farther to say, God is equally present everywhere. This is a truth that we really need to contemplate. He's equally present everywhere. He's in the marketplace. As Swami says, he's in the bank as much as he is in the mountain. But he's often easier to see in the mountain because we get distracted by all the other conflicting energies. But the main thing we get distracted by is our own reluctance to engage, and our own fear to engage, and the desire for ease and pleasure, and our preferences, rather than what is been put in front of us that really has to be done. Now, there's no need to go out and seek uncongenial circumstances, but when uncongenial circumstances are thrust upon us, it is the ideal challenge for us to begin to understand that my reality is inside of me. And the only reality I ever have is my consciousness. And having to discipline ourselves, the compelling demand of having to discipline ourselves to develop money magnetism in the right way is often exactly the exercise that our soul requires. Well, it's not almost always, it simply is. Someone asked Swami once, how can you tell what your dharma is? He said, well, if there's a job to be done and you're next in line. I mean, much more subtle can be said than that. But it was also, don't make too much of a myth out of this. If life is asking it of you, then you can be pretty sure that God is asking it of you. And as Swami wrote about facing the challenge of, in order to accomplish what he felt Master was calling him to accomplish, he had to face into a challenge he did not want to have to deal with. But he discovered at the end of it that the money had been completely incidental, that what really had transformed was himself. So the question, what is success? Success is not what we do. Success is what we become through what we do. And if we are always looking first to adjusting our consciousness and then expressing that right consciousness in the world, then the material and the spiritual begin to come together, just as Master came here to show us. All is God. Everything is God. Everything is a service to God. Everything can be seen in the light of, Lord, how can I serve? And if that's what our life becomes, everything else follows, and everything that is truly of lasting importance will be magnetized to us. God bless you.